The road from Monterey to Cloudy Mountain was empty, hot, and cruel. Dust rolled over the hills like smoke, and the girl rode alone with one hand tight on the reins. Behind her saddle, a small bundle of supplies bounced against the leather with every step of her horse. She had made that ride many times before. The miners called her brave for it. Sheriff Rance called her foolish. But the girl had never feared the road, not until that afternoon.
Now before that, Rattlesnake struck and changed everything. I ought to tell you something about the girl. I'm Abel Beecham, though most folks who pass through my old store call me Mr. B. I've seen plenty of lonely souls warm their hands beside my potbelly stove. But loneliness wears strangely on a woman everybody claims to love. The miners of Cloudy Mountain would have fought the devil for that girl, yet not one of them truly knew the quiet ache she carried. And on that road from Monterey, all it took was one stranger seeing her differently for her whole life to begin turning.
A rattlesnake snapped from the brush. Her horse screamed, reared high, and twisted toward the edge of the trail. For one terrible breath, the girl felt the reins burn through her fingers as she slipped backward in the saddle. Then a young horseman rode hard from the bend ahead. He caught her horse by the bridle, leaned close to the frightened animal, and spoke in a low, steady voice until its front hooves came down in the dust. The girl sat frozen, one hand gripping the saddle horn. "You're safe now," he said. No one on that lonely road had ever spoken to her so gently. He was handsome in a sun-darkened, sorrowful way, with fine manners that did not seem to belong among dust, snakes, and mining trails. When her horse settled, he stepped down, picked a few wildflowers from the hillside, and offered them to her with a small bow. "For the lady," he said. Not for the queen of the polka. Not for the girl every miner in camp tried to protect. For the lady. The words touched something quiet and hungry in her heart. She smiled before she could stop herself. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated just long enough for the wind to pass between them. "Johnson," he said. "Dick Johnson." But that was not the name his dying father had given him. And before long, that hidden name would bring blood, shame, and mercy to the doors of Cloudy Mountain. Far below Cloudy Mountain, in a crumbling adobe house hidden among dry ravines, the young horseman knelt beside his father's bed. The old Spaniard was dying, but pride still burned in his eyes. "They took our land," his father whispered. "They took our honor. They called me a thief after stealing everything I owned." Around the room stood hard-faced men with pistols on their hips and dust on their boots. They were not grieving like sons. They were waiting for orders, waiting for a new chief. The young man bowed his head. Ramirez. That was his true name. Not Johnson. Not the polite stranger who had steadied the girl's horse on the road. Ramirez. His father gripped his wrist with a hand as thin as bone. "Swear you will lead them." The son looked at the men. Then he thought of the girl on the Monterey road, and the way she had smiled when he called her a lady, not a symbol, not a prize. "I swear," he said softly. But the oath tasted like iron in his mouth. By sundown, his father was dead, and the gang had already begun testing him. His lieutenant rode in with word of a poor wagon family crossing the lower trail. One man, one woman, 2 children, and a mule half dead from thirst. "Easy money," the lieutenant said. "No guards, no guns worth fearing." Ramirez stood in the doorway and looked toward the red sky. The old oath still burned in his ears, but so did the memory of the girl's face. "No," he said. The men stared. The lieutenant's smile faded. "They are Americans." Ramirez turned back slowly. "They are hungry." No one spoke. "Let them pass," he ordered, "and leave water on the trail where they can find it." That was not what the gang expected from their new chief. For the first time, they saw Ramirez refuse cruelty. And for the first time, Ramirez wondered if a man could inherit a dark name and still choose a different soul. Cloudy Mountain Camp was no place for gentleness. It was a raw little world of mud, pine smoke, gun belts, card tables, and men who had been away from home so long they could barely remember their mothers' voices. But in the middle of that rough camp stood the Polka Saloon, and behind the bar stood the girl. No one in camp remembered who first called her that. Years ago, old Sonora had carried her through the saloon doors as a half-starved orphan child wrapped in a torn blanket. She had been too small to know her own place in the world, so the miners gave her one. They raised her as best rough men could. Now she ruled the polka with a coffee pot in one hand and a warning glance sharp enough to stop a fight. If a man was broke, she gave him coffee instead of whiskey. If a miner could not write, she wrote his letters home. If two gamblers reached for pistols, she stepped between them before the guns cleared leather. "Not in my house," she would say. And somehow, they listened. Behind the bar she kept a little Bible, clean bandages, and a tin of peppermint candy for men homesick to admit they needed comfort. The boys adored her. They would have fought for her, lied for her, and died for her. But when the lamps burned low and the last drunken song faded into the cold mountain dark, the girl climbed the narrow trail alone to her cabin above camp. On her windowsill sat the wildflowers from the Monterey road, still bright in a chipped cup. She looked at them longer than she meant to. The whole camp loved her, but none of them knew the ache she carried, loved by every man, belonging to none. And for the first time in years, the girl wondered what it would feel like to be cherished by one heart only. Sheriff Jack Rance watched Cloudy Mountain the way a hawk watches a field. Nothing escaped him. Not a loaded card, not a whispered threat, not a stranger riding in with polished boots, a fine saddle, and too many secrets behind his eyes. Rance believed the camp survived because men feared the law. And in Cloudy Mountain, he was the law. He kept order with a cold voice, a steady pistol, and a heart he had trained not to tremble, except around the girl. She was the one soft thing in that hard camp. The one person who could make a killer lower his gun, or a drunk miner weep over a letter from home. Rance loved her, but not gently. He wanted to lift her out of the polka, put a ring on her hand, and keep her far from whiskey, dust, and desperate men. In his mind, that was protection. In her heart, it felt too much like a cage. One evening, as she wrapped a clean bandage around a miner's cut hand, Rance stood near the end of the bar and watched her work. "You can't save every broken soul that walks through your door," he said. The girl tied the bandage and looked up at him. "Maybe not," she said, "but I can save the one in front of me." The wounded miner lowered his eyes, grateful and ashamed. Rance's jaw tightened. To him, mercy was a crack in the wall. One crack, and chaos came pouring through. Still, as he watched the miner leave with his hand wrapped and his pride spared, something in Rance went quiet. The girl's mercy made men better for a moment. That was what frightened him. And when Rance heard that Ramirez, the outlaw feared by every traveler on the lower trails, had been seen near Cloudy Mountain, he made himself a silent promise. He would protect the camp. He would protect the girl, even if protection became the very thing that broke her heart. The piano was banging out a crooked tune. Miners shouted over cards. Rain tapped against the windows, and the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and coffee filled the room. Then the door opened. Dick Johnson stepped into the polka and stopped in the doorway. He stood there with his hat in his hand, his coat dark from rain, and that same quiet courtesy the girl remembered from the Monterey road. The whole saloon seemed to feel him before anyone said a word. A hush did not fall all at once. It moved slowly, man by man. Her heart knew him before her voice did. "You," she said softly. Johnson smiled, but there was sorrow tucked behind it. "I was hoping you'd remember." A miner near the stove coughed hard into his sleeve. Without making a show of it, Johnson stepped aside, helped the man lower himself onto a bench, and reached for a cup of water from the bar. The girl noticed. So did Sheriff Rance. From the corner table, Rance looked up from his cards. He noticed the clean way Johnson spoke, the careful hands, the fine saddle tied beneath the rain shed. Most of all, he noticed the girl's face. She was not smiling like the queen of the polka. She was smiling like a lonely woman who had just seen a door open. The miners welcomed Johnson because the girl welcomed him. They clapped his back, poured him coffee, and asked where he had ridden from. "South," Johnson said. Rance's eyes narrowed. That's a large country for such a small answer. Johnson met his gaze, calm but guarded. A man can lose himself there. The girl heard the sadness in that line and it pulled her closer. But Rance heard something else, a secret. And before the night was over, he meant to start digging for it. By the time the storm broke over Cloudy Mountain, the trail to the girl's cabin had turned black with mud. Outside the Polka, Johnson saw her struggling to keep 2 small flour sacks wrapped beneath her shawl as the rain swept across the camp. He stepped forward without being asked. "Let me carry those." "I've carried worse," she said. "I don't doubt it," he answered. "But you don't have to carry this alone." Those words quieted her more than the thunder. She remembered how he had steadied her horse on the Monterey road. She remembered how he had helped the coughing miner inside the Polka without asking for praise. So she let him take the flour. Together, they climbed the slick path above camp. Johnson carried the sacks beneath an oilcloth over one shoulder and held the lantern low in his other hand, lighting the mud and stones in front of them. Rain beat against their coats. Twice, the girl slipped. Twice, Johnson stopped and waited without touching her unless she reached for his arm. That mattered to her. At the cabin door, she hesitated. A woman did not invite a stranger inside without giving the whole camp something to talk about. But Johnson was soaked through, and every kindness he had shown her had been careful, not greedy. So she opened the door. Inside, the cabin was small, warm, and plain. A stove, a table, a narrow bed, a chipped cup of wildflowers on the windowsill. Johnson noticed the wildflowers he had given her on the Monterey road. For a moment, his face softened. She had kept them. But then he looked away, ashamed, because she had kept a gift from a man who had not even given her his true name. The girl set the lantern on the table and poured coffee. Johnson accepted the cup with both hands. For a while they listened to the rain. "Everyone in camp loves you," he said. The girl gave a sad little smile. "Yes, that's the lonely part." Johnson looked at her then, truly looked. She swallowed. "They love what I mean to them. Home, decency, forgiveness. But when the lamps go out, I'm still just me." Johnson's voice dropped. "Maybe just you was enough." No man had ever said it that way. The fire cracked softly between them. He told her he had lived too long beneath a name he did not choose. He did not tell her what name, not yet. But shame sat heavy on his shoulders. "I have dreamed of honest work," he said. "A little ranch beyond the roads, horses, good soil, a door no man has to hide behind." "And a wife?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Johnson looked at her as if the answer frightened him. "Yes," he said. "If I could ever become the sort of man she would not have to be ashamed of." The girl reached across the table and touched his hand. He did not seize it. He only turned his palm upward and let her choose whether to stay. Outside, the storm raged harder. Inside, for one fragile hour, 2 lonely souls believed they might still be saved. By noon the next day, the lie could not hold. Sheriff Rance came into the Polka with a torn wanted notice in his hand and ice in his eyes. He crossed straight to the bar and slapped the paper down in front of the girl. "Ask your friend what name his father gave him." The room went still. Johnson stood near the stove, hat in hand. He looked from the wanted notice to the girl, and for one painful moment, he seemed to beg her without speaking. But the paper had already spoken. Ramirez, bandit, road agent, son of a notorious outlaw chief. The girl felt the saloon tilt beneath her. "You?" she whispered. Johnson took one step toward her. "I never came here to hurt you. But you came wearing another man's name." His face broke with shame. "I was born into blood I did not choose." The words cut deeper because she remembered what he had told her in the cabin. A name he did not choose. A door no man had to hide behind. And now she understood why he had sounded so ashamed. "Leave," she said. Johnson stopped as if the word had struck him. "Please," he whispered. The girl's eyes filled, but her voice did not shake. "Leave my saloon." And he did. That night, gunfire cracked below the ridge. The girl stood at her cabin window and saw flashes through the trees, far down near the lower trail. She did not know the full truth yet. Johnson had refused to let his men raid the Polka, and the gang had turned on him for it. Near midnight, a weak knock scraped against her cabin door. When she opened it, Johnson fell against the doorframe, bleeding through his coat and burning with fever. Every law in camp said she should run for Rance. Every wound in her heart said she should let him fall. Instead, she caught his arm, dragged him inside, and lowered him onto the floor beside the stove. As she cut away the torn cloth near his side and pressed a clean bandage against the wound, Johnson whispered the truth between fevered breaths. "I sent them away," he said. "Told them the gang was finished." The girl froze. Johnson swallowed hard. "There's stolen gold hidden near the old creek bed. Some of it came from this camp. I meant to return it." Her hands trembled, but she kept pressure on the wound. The girl whispered, "You should have told me." Johnson's eyes closed with shame. "I know." Her voice sharpened through the tears. "Do you?" He looked up at her, helpless and ashamed. "I know now." For a moment, the only sound was rain dripping from his coat onto the floorboards. Then she tied the bandage tight and fought back tears. The man her heart had begun to love was guilty, but he had bled rather than let his men hurt the Polka. He had lied to her. But now, for the first time, he was trying to stop living as a lie, and that made mercy more dangerous than hate. Before dawn, Sheriff Rance came to the cabin. The girl had barely helped Johnson climb into the loft when the knock struck the door like a pistol shot. Johnson was weak with fever, and every movement made him bite back pain. He lay flat above the rafters while the girl hurried down the ladder and wiped her bloody hands on a cloth. Then she opened the door. Rance stepped inside without waiting to be invited. His eyes moved over the room, the damp coat near the stove, the bloody cloth on the floor, the second coffee cup on the table, the ladder still pulled close to the loft, and the fear the girl could not fully hide. "He's here," Rance said. The girl lifted her chin. "You don't know that." Rance looked up toward the loft. Up in the loft, Johnson tried to lift himself onto one elbow, but pain forced him back down. Rance drew his pistol and aimed it upward. "Come down, Ramirez." The girl stepped between Rance and the ladder, though she could not block the gun from where Johnson lay. "If you take him now, they'll hang him before sunrise." Rance's eyes flicked toward the window where gray light was beginning to show. "If I take him down to camp now," Rance said, "those men may hang him before I can stop them." The girl stepped closer, then let him answer another way. Rance's voice hardened. "He is a bandit. He is trying to make right what he did," the girl said. Rance's face hardened. "And you believe him because your heart has already chosen him." The words struck the cabin silent. Then Rance lowered the pistol, walked to the table, and pulled a deck of cards from his coat. "One hand," Rance said. "Poker. If you win, he rides out alive. If I win, I take him down to camp myself before the mob gets him." The girl stared at him. She had watched men lose minds, horses, and souls at card tables. Now the wager was a life. Johnson's voice came weakly from the loft. "Don't do this." But the girl sat down. Rance sat across from her, his pistol resting near his right hand on the table. The cards fell. Rance played cold. The girl played trembling. When she saw her hand would lose, a desperate thought rose inside her. If she played fair, Johnson would hang. If she cheated, something clean inside her would break. While Rance glanced toward the loft at the sound of Johnson coughing, the girl slipped a hidden card from her sleeve. Her voice shook as she laid it down. "I win." Rance looked at the cards, then at her face. He knew. For a long moment he said nothing. At last he stood, wounded deeper than anger could show. "You saved his life tonight," he said, "but you did not save either of you from justice." Then he took his pistol, stepped out into the gray morning, and left the girl with victory on the table and shame burning through her heart. Johnson could have run before the sun cleared the ridge. His horse stood saddled outside the cabin, tied to the porch rail. The lower trail was open. The girl stood in the doorway with tears still bright in her eyes, and every frightened part of her wanted him gone before Rance returned with men and rope. But Johnson did not mount. He was pale from fever, and the bandage beneath his coat was already stained red. Every step pulled at the wound in his side. Every breath cost him. Still, he turned back into the cabin and sat at her table. With shaking hands, he pulled a sheet of paper close and wrote the truth. He wrote his real name, Ramirez. He wrote the names of the men who still followed the gang. He marked every hidden cache he knew about: the dry creek bed, the split pine above the wagon road, and the loose stones near the old ravine. Each line came slow. More than once, he had to stop and press one hand against his side until the pain passed. Then he took the stolen gold he had brought with him, tied it inside a canvas sack, and set it beside the door. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. The girl watched him from the doorway. "You'll hang if they catch you." Johnson folded the confession and tucked it inside his coat. "Then let them catch the man I truly am," he said, "not the coward I was." She wanted to argue. She wanted to beg. But there was something new in him now. Something steadier than charm and stronger than shame. He was not running from his name anymore. He stepped close and took her hand. For one breath, she thought he might kiss her lips. Instead, he bowed his head and kissed her hand once, gently, as if asking forgiveness he had not yet earned. "I cannot ask mercy from honest men while hiding what I stole from them." Then he lifted the canvas sack of gold with a grimace, tied it to his saddle, and mounted with effort. The girl stayed in the doorway as he rode down toward Cloudy Mountain with the confession in his coat, the gold tied to his saddle, and the first honest courage of his life. Johnson never reached the Polka. 3 miners caught him at the bend below the wash, where the trail narrowed between dark pines and broken stone. He was too weak to fight them. They saw the canvas sack tied to his saddle first. Then they found the folded confession tucked inside his coat. By the time they dragged him into Cloudy Mountain, the whole camp knew. Men came running from gold claims, cabins, gambling tables, and cook fires. Some carried rifles. Some carried lanterns. One carried a coil of rope. Johnson stood in the middle of them, pale from blood loss but straight-backed, with his hands tied in front of him. The canvas sack was dropped at his feet. "I have stolen from some of you," he said, "and I have come to return what I can." A miner kicked the sack, and gold clinked inside. "Gold don't pay for nights," our wives cried, the man shouted. "Gold don't give back peace to the roads." The crowd growled. Old Sonora pushed forward, his weathered face tight with grief. "Where's the girl?" he asked. No one answered. Sheriff Rance stood apart near the assay office, silent and grim, with Johnson's folded confession in his hand. He had wanted law. But as the men shoved Johnson toward the hanging beam, Rance saw something uglier than law rising in the camp. He saw vengeance. The rope was thrown over a heavy wooden beam outside the assay office. Johnson did not beg. He only looked once toward the narrow mountain path that led to the girl's cabin. Then someone shouted, "Hang him!" And the lonely boys of Cloudy Mountain, who had once wept under the girl's gentle hands, began to forget the mercy she had spent years teaching them. The girl came riding down the mountain like a prayer answered just before the rope could fall. Her horse slid in the mud as she reached the edge of camp. Her hair had come loose. Her face was white with fear, but her eyes were steady. She swung down before the horse had fully settled and pushed through the crowd toward the assay office. "Move," she said. And because it was her, they moved. Johnson stood beneath the hanging beam with his hands tied in front of him. The rope hung above him. He was wounded, ashamed, and ready to die. When he saw her, pain crossed his face deeper than any bullet wound. "Don't," he whispered. But the girl did not look away. She turned to the miners, the gamblers, and the hard old men who had raised her, guarded her, and loved her in the only rough way they knew. "So this is what my boys have become?" she asked. No one answered. "You come to me when your hands are split open. You come to me when fever takes you. You come to me when you cannot write your mothers, your wives, or your children." Her voice broke, but it did not weaken. "I have read your letters. I have prayed beside your sickbeds. I have fed you when your pockets were empty. I have trusted you with my door, my home, and my life." A miner lowered his eyes. She pointed toward Johnson. "He is guilty. I will not lie for him. He stole from some of you. He frightened this camp. He wore a false name in my house." Johnson bowed his head. The girl stepped closer to the rope, close enough that every man had to see her standing between love and death. "But if you hang him after he came back with the gold, with his signed confession, and with the places where the rest is hidden, then this is not justice. This is anger wearing a badge." Rance's face tightened, but he did not speak. The crowd stirred. The canvas sack of gold lay in the mud near Johnson's boots. The confession was open in Rance's hand now, its ink blurred at the edges from the rain. Johnson lifted his voice, weak but clear. "She speaks kinder of me than I deserve. I am Ramirez. I led men who robbed these roads. The gold there is yours. That paper names every hidden cache I know." He swallowed hard. "I will work every year God leaves me to repay what remains." Then he looked at the girl. "And if you cannot spare me, spare her shame. She believed I could change. Let that be the purest thing about this day." The girl's tears fell freely now. Old Sonora stepped forward first. "This girl once sat beside me 3 nights when fever near took my life," he said. "If she asks for mercy, I'll not answer her with murder." One by one, men looked at the rope, then at the girl, then at themselves. A rifle lowered, then another. The man holding the rope loosened his grip, and in the hush that followed, Cloudy Mountain remembered it still had a soul. For a long moment, no one touched the rope. The crowd stood in a shamed silence. Then Rance stepped forward. His face was pale, but his hand was steady as he drew his knife. The crowd parted for him, not with fear now, but with shame. He looked at Johnson first. "You are spared the rope," Rance said, "not the debt." Johnson lifted his head. "You leave this camp under my word and under your own confession. You make good on every dollar your hand can reach. You name every man still riding under your old gang. And if I ever hear that Ramirez has become an outlaw again, mercy will not ride twice." Johnson nodded, weak but clear. "You have my word." Rance turned to the girl. Something wounded passed through his eyes, but it did not turn cruel. "You chose him," he said. The girl answered softly. "I chose what I believe mercy can make of him, but he must prove it every day." Rance held her gaze for one aching breath. Then he reached up and cut the rope. It fell into the mud like a dead snake. No one cheered. Some men wept. Some turned away. But every man there knew something larger than an outlaw's life had been spared. Cloudy Mountain had nearly become a place where repentance was useless and anger called itself justice. The girl had stopped them at the edge. Before sundown, Johnson was lifted onto his horse, weak but alive. The return gold was counted under Rance's eye. 2 miners copied the cache locations from Johnson's confession, then rode out to search the hiding places he had named. Then the girl walked back into the Polka Saloon one last time, to say goodbye to the only home she had ever known. The lamps were unlit. The tables were quiet. Her little Bible still rested behind the bar beside the clean bandages and the peppermint tin. She touched the Bible with trembling fingers, then left it where it was. The boys would need it now more than ever. Old Sonora waited near the door, twisting his hat in both hands. Years ago, he had carried her into that saloon as a hungry orphan child wrapped in a torn blanket. Now he looked at her as if letting go was the hardest labor of his life. "You don't have to belong to all of us forever," he said. Her lips trembled. Sonora took the small prayer medal from around his neck and pressed it into her palm like a father giving his blessing. "You go be loved by one good heart," he whispered, "and make sure he earns the blessing." The girl closed her hand around the medal. Then Sonora said a name no one in camp had spoken for years. "Go on now, Nenah." The sound of it broke something open in her. Not the girl, not the queen of the polka. Nenah, a woman with a name of her own. She threw her arms around Sonora and held him tight. "I'll miss my boys," she whispered. "We'll miss our girl," he said. "But you were never ours to keep." At dawn, she rode out beside Johnson toward the mountains, slow enough for his wound and quiet enough for goodbye, not as the queen of a saloon following an outlaw, but as Nenah, a woman choosing her own life. At the ridge, Johnson reined in and looked back at Cloudy Mountain. Nenah stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she climbed down from her horse and helped him dismount carefully, one hand steadying his arm when the wound pulled at his side. "I will spend the rest of my life proving they were right to spare me," he said. Nenah looked at the camp below, then at the wounded man standing beside her. "Prove it with work," she said softly. "Not words." Johnson nodded. Then, with the first sunlight breaking over the mountains, he leaned close and kissed her once. It was not a stolen kiss. It was not a wild kiss. It was a promise. Months later, in a small mission town beyond the high passes, they were married. There were no grand guests and no rich flowers. Only a priest, 2 witnesses, Sonora's prayer medal in Nenah's hand, and Johnson standing beside her with honest tears in his eyes. When the priest asked if he would honor her, Johnson did not answer quickly. He looked at Nenah first, then he said, "Every day God gives me." After that, Johnson bred horses, broke colts, mended fences, and sent restitution money back to Cloudy Mountain whenever he could. Every dollar was a prayer. Every honest day was a promise kept. And Nenah made their little home a refuge for lonely travelers, widows, and miners far from family. The polka had lost its queen, but Nenah had gained a husband, a home, and a love that lived beside her every day. It sat beside her at supper. It worked beside her in the dust. And it proved, day by day, that mercy is never wasted when it leads a guilty heart back to the light.
Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, please like and share. It really helps us. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Before you go, rate this story 0 to 10 in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next tale.